Usually you have obligations towards people, sometimes towards communities of people, but I felt I had an obligation towards an idea that came to me in 1982. And without this moral obligation to the idea, I wouldn't have had the courage, even with the help of my colleague Yannick, to write this book. But I felt that this idea now attracted a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, and therefore also a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of confusions, a lot of misinformation. And for that reason, we thought we had to produce something that would be a good, reliable toolkit for the people advocating basic income around the world, but also for people criticizing it. So this idea came to me in 1982 in response to two problems that that were very important to me at the time and still now. One problem was, how can we address the problem of massive unemployment without relying on the solution which at the time was advocated by both the right and the left, which was continued growth fast enough to constantly keep pace with the growth of productivity. And the second question I asked myself at the time was, how could we provide a sort of exciting, mobilizing vision of the future for our societies, which wouldn't be either something like a gradual submission of more and more aspects of our lives to the market, as in the neoliberal utopia, or the increasing submission or the massive submission of all aspects of our life to the control of the state, as in the socialist utopia. And suddenly, one evening as I was washing up, suddenly, click, I thought, I've got it. Very simple, dead simple idea, an unconditional basic income. Unconditional in three distinct senses, which make it radically different from what we know as public assistance, social assistance in many countries. One, it's strictly individual, so you don't need to check with whom people live in order to determine whether they're entitled to it or how much they will receive. Two, it's universal, it's not means tested, no need to check how much people earn from other sources in order to determine whether they're entitled to it. And three, it's also not work tested, obligation free, no need to check whether the people, the recipients, are able to work, whether they are willing to work. You get it unconditionally. When you think, I've had a brilliant idea, usually one of two things happen. First possibility, you think a bit more about it, you talk about it with your girlfriend, with your grandmother, with your colleagues, and you discover that there is a flaw. I've had the opportunity to think about it again and again and to listen to objections to it in all 5 continents, in, I think, 7 different languages. I discovered many difficulties, some unexpected, and I'll turn to one of them in a minute, but no real flaw, no fatal flaw. After all those years, I still believe in it. But then, if that doesn't happen, something else happens. You discover that you are far from being the first one to have come to that idea. And that happened bit by bit. I discovered people who sometimes long ago had come through different paths to that same idea, including after 20 years, I discovered that the very first to have proposed that idea at the level of a country was a bloke in my native city of Brussels in 1848, a bloke called Joseph Charlier had made the first proposal of this sort in a book called Solution du problème social, Solution of the Social Problem, exactly the same year as Marx had written also in Brussels his Communist Manifesto, which was promised to a far more glorious future. So I discovered many people had had that idea. many of them were dead, but a few were still living at the time. And what I did in 1986, and Juliana has just been referring to it, is I gathered all the people who I discovered had the same idea or the similar idea. I gathered them in Louvain-la-Neuve, and we founded what became then the Basic Income European Network. We hesitated a bit about the name because in England at the time the most common expression to refer to it was social dividend. In the United States it was demogrant. In the Scandinavian countries it was citizen's wage. In French I had to invent a new expression because no one ever talked about it. I called it allocation universelle, in universal benefit, in analogy to universal suffrage. Finally, we settled for the expression that was used in the only country at the time in which there was a real public debate on the issue, which was the Netherlands, where it was called basisinkomen, and so we decided to call it basic income. Became the Basic Income European Network. The acronym was fantastic, bien, in French or in Spanish. It means good. Who could be against that? And when, as more and more people from outside Europe joined the congresses we had every 2 years, we gradually realized that it made sense to have something that would not just be limited to Europe, but that would be worldwide. And then it became, not very elegantly, the Basic Income Earth Network, but the acronym was too nice. What I found very important in the life of that network is that we absolutely had to avoid becoming some sort of sect where you had only enthusiastic activists who were just coming together to pat on each other's shoulders every 2 years and who kept just sending each other only comforting information. It was absolutely essential to remain open to objections, to invite critics, to invite people who didn't believe in basic income, in either the desirability or the possibility of basic income at these meetings. And this, I think, is part of the strength of a network. What I want to do today is shed light briefly on the two aspects of the subtitle of our book. Our book is called A Radical Proposal for a Free Society and a Sane Economy. I'll discuss the first aspect, the free society, in connection with this objection that came to me initially as a surprise, and I'll discuss the second component, the sane economy, in conjunction with one pro-argument, which is often used, and allegedly in particular in the Silicon Valley, one frequent argument in favor of basic income today. First then, this objection, and that will lead me to this idea, my interpretation of this free society. I told you the idea came to me in 1982. In 1985, I was a visiting lecturer at the University of Amsterdam. And I was asked to moderate a debate between two colleagues there. One was a Marxist economist, and the other one was a sociologist, but also member of the leadership of the Dutch Labour Party, then one of the two main parties in the Netherlands. Moderate a debate on basic income. The Marxist economist said, basic income, unconditional basic income. That's a fantastic idea. This will enable workers to avoid being forced, no longer to be forced to sell their labor, to sell their labor to the capitalists, to the owners of capital. It's a fantastic idea. It's Marx's Reich der Freiheit, realm of freedom. That fantastic. But unfortunately, we live in a capitalist society, power relations are there, and this is simply impossible under capitalism. And then came the other guy, who was called Trump, not Trump, Trump. And he said, oh, come on. You said, you Marxist, you said that universal suffrage would be impossible under capitalism. We social democrats, we did it. You said that social security, social insurance would not be possible because capitalist relationships wouldn't allow it. We social democrats, we did it. You said impossible to regulate the labor market because of the... We did it. Unconditional basic income. If we wanted, we could do it. But there's no way we'll do it, because the right to an income must be reserved to people who work or to people who are unable to work for whatever reasons. So it is perfectly feasible, we could do it, but there is no way we'll do it. It would be scandalous, profoundly unjust to do it. Ooh, this came as a surprise, because I thought it seemed such a sensible idea to me. So I thought there is a job for a philosopher there in order to try to show that this is compatible, at least compatible with justice. And then I thought, but I didn't need to think that much, because I had read with great attention, not so long before, a rather famous book in political philosophy called A Theory of Justice by John Rawls. And the theory which Rawls is proposing, so it's a theory of justice published in 1971, really revolutionized the field of political philosophy, not just in Europe, not just in the United States, but gradually throughout the world. And he there proposes a theory of justice with, as part of its second component, one of his principles, something called the difference principle. What does this difference principle say? It says that inequalities can be just, but only if they contribute to improve the fate of the worse off, defined by the social and economic advantages attached to the worse social positions. And what are these social and economic advantages which must be provided at the highest possible level to the worst off? Rawls gives a list. He says income. Okay, income, but income could be given, guaranteed in many ways, not only through a basic income. But he also says it's not just income, it's also wealth. And wealth, well, an unconditional income is, of course, far more like something like wealth than is just a wage, than a wage is. And then he also says the powers and prerogatives related to these social positions. But yes, an unconditional basic income is also a matter of bargaining power, of giving workers power, not just an income, not just wealth. And then he also says, well, but the most important of these primary goods, social primary goods, governed by the principles of justice, the most important of all is the social basis of self-respect. So that's it, because social basis of self-respect, precisely if you give this income unconditionally to every citizen or every permanent resident, it's of course far more humiliating, far less demeaning than if you have a means-tested scheme where you provide a minimum income only to the destitute or to the deserving poor. So I thought, there we have it. It's all ready-made. I have it. But then came one of the biggest disappointments of my intellectual life. 1987, this was, this debate in Amsterdam was 1985. 1987, publication in Paris of the French edition of Rawls' Theory of Justice. There were a few foreign guys invited there, including Rawls himself, Dworkin, Sen, a German philosopher, and me, practically the only person at the time in the Francophone world who had read Rawls. And there was my luck, but in a way the source of my disappointment too, of the people who were accommodated in the hotel, which was called the Hôtel des Grands Hommes, just next to the Pantheon in Paris. The only two who got up early for breakfast were Rawls and me. So Rawls, gentleman, very kind person, so I asked, can I join you? Yes, of course. So And twice in a row, 2 days in a row, we had this long conversation where I felt a bit like a graduate student with all these questions to ask to a professor, and had, I don't know, 72 questions or so that came out of reading Theory of Justice. I couldn't ask them all, but there was one I wanted to ask him where I waited for an answer with some trepidation. And I said, isn't it obvious, given what you say in your book and earlier articles about negative income tax, but above all, if you read the content of your difference principle, that you are in favor of an unconditional basic income? And then he said, come on, Philippe, the surfers who choose to spend their days surfing off Malibu, surely they should support themselves. They can't expect from society to pay for their living. Oh, that was a disappointment. So it didn't follow, after all, from his principles, but I thought I had made an honest, unbiased reading of his principles. And then, in the written version of the lecture he gave on that occasion, there's a little footnote about the Malibu surfers, and he changes his difference principle. He adds in the social and economic advantages chosen leisure. Leisure, he says, counts if you choose to spend your day on Malibu or whatever. And so this leisure must be counted as equivalent to a minimum wage. So you are not, if you choose to spend your day on the beach, it's not as if you had a zero income. It's as if you had an income equivalent to the minimum wage, and so therefore there is no reason why you should be considered among the worst off. Oh, so that was a bit of a nasty trick. I thought, when I thought I had something ready-made with the greatest authority in political philosophy to go back to this Trump and told him, to be able to tell him, look, the most respectable conception of justice justifies the basic income. I couldn't do it. So I had to do a bit more work. And so sometime late in 1990, then Rawls and Sen invited me to give a lecture at Harvard, and I couldn't miss that opportunity to propose what I thought I had found. And that's then the lecture I gave, which was later published under the title, Why Surfers Should Be Fed. And the central part of that argument is also present and in the book that Juliana referred to, Real Freedom for All, and the Oxford University Press editor, having read the article, chose to put a surfer on the cover of the book. So since then I have this strange association with surfers. I'm completely unable to surf, but anyway. So, but that, I won't be much longer on that, but this, and so what I was forced to do is really to articulate something which Rawls or Dworkin and Sen tried to articulate, which is clearly our conception of justice must make room at the same time for the importance we attach to equality, the importance we attach to freedom, and the importance we attach to efficiency. And I tried to provide in that book, summarized in the slogan, Real Freedom for All, a conception of justice that articulates these various components and has, as a pretty direct implication, the justification of an unconditional basic income. The title of this book, so for a free society, is a free society that satisfies this conception of justice. In fact, we initially thought of having as the title of the book the instrument of freedom, inspired by a quote from Rousseau with which we start on our preface, which says, the money one possesses is the instrument of freedom. The money one seeks to obtain, one strives to obtain, is the instrument of slavery. And this is really an intuition that's central in the whole of our book. It's also what inspires our discussion of what we call the cousins of basic income, a number of other proposals like Ned Phelps's wage subsidies, or other proposals, basic endowment, negative income tax, etc. What inspires what justifies our preference for an unconditional basic income needs to rest on some factual assumptions, but also on value judgment that is captured by this idea of real freedom for all. And it's also that idea that is supposed to be conveyed on the cover of the book by these hot air balloons. The idea of hot air is not too good for the cover of the book, but the balloons are fine because we wanted really to indicate clearly that basic income, of course, is relevant to the fight against poverty, but it won't be sufficient to eliminate income poverty, however you define it, and it's not exclusively concerned with the abolition of or the reduction of poverty. It's really concerned with the freedom of all, and so the idea of a really free society. So that's what I wanted to say then related to the first component of the undertitle. And now I turn to the second thing I would like to say today, and which is then related to the future of work and the second component of the subtitle, so this idea of a sane economy. One of the most frequent arguments we hear in favor of basic income lately is one, it's commonly attributed or associated with Silicon Valley, but it's certainly not exclusively propagated in Silicon Valley. The argument simply goes as follows: we can expect a lot more of robotization. We can expect artificial intelligence to do quite a few jobs which are currently done by human beings. That means that there will be less jobs, there will be more workers displaced in this way, and we must be humane, so at least we must enable these workers not to starve, and at the same time we must also, if only out of self-interest, make sure that these people are able to consume the goods that will be produced by the robots and the services produced by artificial intelligence. It's become a pretty common argument indeed when there was this campaign for the Swiss referendum on basic income last year, so it took place in June 2016. The initiators of the referendum organized a demonstration of robots in Davos. So there was the World Summit in Davos, and in the streets of Davos there were robots that were demonstrating in favor of a basic income. So that's an argument that you often hear and that's often uttered. What to make of it? Well, as you probably know, many of you know, the economists disagree about the strength of this argument, and I must say that my skepticism about the strength of this argument is revived once a month when I receive a magazine in French. I received number 1000, just before I came, 1183 of a magazine with the title La grande relève des hommes par la machine, the great replacement of man by the machine. A monthly issue number 1182, right? It's a monthly that was founded in 1935 by a French bloke who had been a minister called Jacques Dubois, and who was convinced that a big crisis of underconsumption was imminent because men were replaced by machines, and therefore we needed urgently to introduce something he called a social income, which he imagined could be funded by money creation. And so there is this little sect, let's say, the Mouvement Français pour l'Abondance, which very persistently publishes every month the latest version of of something like the argument which we hear today about the effects of robotization and artificial intelligence. So there is, of course, today something new relative to then, or relative to when similar arguments were used in the United States in the 1960s, which is that in the past, under the powerful people, the people in authority on the left and the right, could easily dismiss this by saying, we'll solve it with growth, right? Okay, you need only one worker instead of 4 to produce a car. Well, we'll produce 4 cars, right? That was the standard answer. Since then, skepticism about the possibility of growth and about the desirability of growth have grown considerably. And today it's not as easy to dismiss it in this way. And that's why the idea of trying something else, namely a universal basic income, has become more popular in wider circles and in wider circles than was at the time, because it's not as easy to dismiss. Now, we certainly don't make our argument, our defense of basic income, rest on an argument of this type, but technology and technical change has something to do with the particular need for a basic income today. But I think the best way, or we argue in the book that the best way to formulate it is rather to see technology and modern technical change in interaction with a number of other trends, in particular globalization, but also, for example, the shrinking of the average size of firms, the weakening of the trade unions. And so technical change together with these other trends tends to have as an effect an increasing polarization of the earning power in our society. So the people who have scarce and highly valuable skills that are of great value throughout the world can see their earning power simply rocket. Or the people who own valuable intellectual property rights. And of course, if they can save a lot, there's also the whole dynamics of cumulative dynamics of capital. That means that some people, and so the top 1% or the top 5%, get ever-increasing earnings, have an earning potential that keeps increasing. But the people whose, in our countries, in our richer countries, whose skills are widely distributed, widely shared, well, these people see their earning power gradually sink. Now, if you have that, you could, of course, try to pull these people out of poverty or out of the risk of poverty through having means-tested assistance to them, because they wouldn't have been able to go to have enough through the standard social insurance system. But instead of that, instead of trapping them trapping an increasing number of people in this situation of dependency, it's far better, many people argue, to raise the floor, as it were, to give a floor on which people can stand, which a floor, non-conditional income, which they can combine with income from other sources, which enables them to have a far more flexible back and forth between employment, training, further training throughout life, and family obligations or voluntary work of other types. So that is, in my view, that is the way in which technology is relevant to the argument for basic income. So in this slide, what impact can we expect from universal basic income on the future of work? I think there are 3 important impacts, and all 3 are really important in the case that is being made and that must be made for an unconditional basic income. The first impact is on the redistribution of work. One of the earliest advocates of an unconditional basic income in Europe in the contemporary discussion, so in the late 70s, was a professor of social medicine at the Free University of Amsterdam. He said in a couple of articles he wrote on the topic in the late 70s, he said, well, it's incredible, but I have 2 categories of patients, to simplify. I have one set of patients that consists of people who are sick because they work too much. And then I have another category of people who come to me because they are sick due to the fact that they can't find a job. Surely there is something absurd in this system. And he said, well, the way to solve it is to give this unconditional income, no strings attached. And so the people who work too much will be able to take a break, will be able to reduce their working time. thereby freeing some jobs which could then be filled by the other category of sick people, or could be filled more easily by them, especially, and that's equally important, because these people will be able to combine having a job, if only a part-time job, because some of them wouldn't be able to work full-time, combine this part-time job with the benefits which they would be able to keep. So that's a very important argument, and that's often used in the debate throughout certainly the wealthier part of the world, and that a basic income is in fact an intelligent form of work sharing, far more intelligent, less rigid than reducing the maximum length of the working week for all the waged workers, for example, which is still often proposed by many people in the European context, but which is, in my view, an idea for the 20th century and not for the 21st century. But the basic income is an intelligent, a smart way of redistributing work employment between people, and thereby to make for a more sane economy by not creating these two complementary sorts of sickness. The second impact on the future of work is no doubt that it reduces the centrality or the overall importance of work. Basic income is perfectly consistent with the ideal of full employment, but not if you mean by full employment that both men and women throughout their lives should be, throughout their able-bodied and able-minded life, should be employed full-time. No, basic income is certainly not compatible with that, if only for. But it is perfectly compatible. Indeed, it's an essential instrument to reach the objective of self-employment in the sense of making a job accessible, making work accessible to all those people who want to work. Basic income is meant to achieve that, but to achieve that without trying to constantly invent new ways, new things to produce, new things to consume in order to keep people employed for their whole lives, even doing whatever just in order to be employed. And the third impact on the future of work, equally important and present from the beginning in the defense of basic income, is the impact on the quality of work. And I mentioned before this very early advocate of basic income, so this Joseph Charlier in 1848. And one of the things he immediately stressed, and that's recurring in the debate, is really the fact that the basic income would give more bargaining power to the people who do the most disgusting jobs. He says it's no longer the worker, once you'll have what he calls a territorial dividend, it's no longer the worker who will have to bow before capital. It is capital reduced to its true role of collaborating agent that will have to negotiate with labor on an equal footing. Consequently, repugnant jobs will have greater difficulty being filled. And I quote, undoubtedly by raising and improving the material condition of the masses, the implementation of a guaranteed minimum income will make them choosier in the choice of their occupations. But as this choice is usually determined by the price of manpower, the industries concerned will need to offer their workers a salary high enough to compensate for the inconveniences involved. So if these jobs have to be paid more, of course, a number of them will go and be replaced by machine, or indeed be improved. And even before Joseph Charlier, so the early utopian socialist Charles Fourier didn't propose a universal basic income. It was means-tested for him, but it was certainly obligation-free. And there's a famous passage in which he says, as the masses, once an abundant minimum is guaranteed to them, and so once they have this guaranteed minimum income, as the masses would want to work only a little or not at all, one would need to discover and organize a regime of attractive industry which would guarantee that people would keep working despite their well-being. And there is this Fourierist, this socialist utopian vision that eventually work will be undistinguishable from play, because only those types of work will survive which have an intrinsic value, which are intrinsically meaningful for the people. And returning to the initial claim and the Silicon Valley claim, can we expect then to be more, the people to work more or less than is currently the case in our societies? Well, it's simply impossible to say. It's impossible to say, in part because it will depend on a number of other institutional arrangements, on the structure of the pension system, of the education system, of various aspects of the regulation of the labor markets. But it will also depend on the net effect of a number of different partial consequences of the introduction of an unconditional basic income. It will depend on the use that will be made of the greater possibility for workers to interrupt their career or to reduce their working time. But it will also depend on the use they will make of the greater ability to work longer, because they will have been able to avoid a burnout, or they will have been able to retrain in time. It will depend on the rate at which it will be possible to replace tedious jobs by machines. And perhaps above all, it will depend on the development of activities with a high intrinsic value to the people. And the sort of activities which, going back to Fourier, would be hardly distinguishable from play. Activities which you would do, things you would do, even if you were not paid for it. No doubt, like teaching Stanford students, right? And the people who do it with such pleasure that they wouldn't need to be paid for it. They would need to have, again, a basic income to keep them alive on the side. But, and so the vision of the future with a basic income high enough means that there will be all these highly productive activities, but that are so enjoyable in themselves that people will be willing to do them just for a little pocket money as a complement to their basic income. Is now, and I conclude with this, is this radical proposal for a free society and a sane economy. Is it a proposal whose time has come? Is it about to be realized? Well, certainly, I think it's fair to say, it's correct to say that in the year 2016 on its own, there has been more written and more discussion about basic income than in the whole of the history of mankind prior to 2016. And that is because of the conjunction, the coincidence, but not random coincidence of a number of events. There has been the Swiss referendum, which I mentioned before, which happened in June 2016 after a successful campaign to get 100,000 signatures, and that triggers the referendum. The proposal was rejected by the Swiss population by more or less three quarters to 1 quarter. I should say that the initiators were proposing a basic income of at the level of 39% of GDP per capita. It means about $2,500 per month and per person. So that didn't help. That helped a lot to collect the 100,000 signatures. People could imagine all the things they would do with that, but it didn't help when all the people who would have to pay for it also were asked for their opinion. That was a very important event in terms of the making people aware of the idea, even in a pretty excessive form and far beyond Switzerland. Then there was also in 2016 then the announcements and the preparation of the Finnish experiment, which is now going since the 1st of January. There was then, to my surprise, I must say, at the end of the year, then the defense, the proposal of basic income by the French socialist politician who emerged, to my great surprise, as the winner of the primaries of the Social Party. He doesn't have a big chance of becoming the next French president, but that again produced an enormous impact in terms of the amount of discussion on the idea. It became really very prominent in the Swiss context. The fourth one certainly is a number of alarmist declarations, including coming from Silicon Valley and around it, about the disappearance of jobs. So each of these events certainly contributed to the spreading of the idea and to the maturing of the debate. Will this then lead to basic income being introduced soon anywhere in the world? Well, there is already something like, there is already an unconditional basic income in two places in the world, namely the state of Alaska and Macau. But this is really anecdotal because the level of the basic income, and so it's in both cases, it's an annual payment to all the permanent residents of those two places. But the level is in case of Alaska, but also Macau, oscillates around 2 or 3% of GDP per capita. So it's very low. The French proposal was about 20% of GDP per capita, and I said the Swiss proposal was nearly 40%. So it's really a different order of magnitude. So will it happen anywhere in the world? Well, it's really impossible to predict, because what you need is a sort of lucky, fortunate, fruitful collaboration between three types of actors, and with the right sort of timing. You need visionaries, but visionaries who are not just dreamers, who thought the idea through, including its ecological, economic, sociological sustainability. You need visionaries. You need then what's sometimes called body kickers, sort of people who are indignant activists, who are enraged by the injustice or the absurdity of the current situation, and who provide the energy for a change. And then you need opportunistic, clever, somewhat Machiavellian thinkers, people who can see the cracks in the system, and so that a reform can be introduced that won't lead to a backlash, but that will create the dynamics that will enable us to go further in this direction. Well, I am sure that in this room there are these three types of people who will help somewhere in the world, perhaps here, perhaps elsewhere, who will help to contribute to the realization of a universal basic income. I hope it will be before I die, but I'm not sure. Thank you very much.